Death, suffering, those are the subjects most Canadians would rather not get into. Yet, we will all be touched by suffering and death, that of our loved ones and at some point our own. In today's episode of the Multiply podcast, we dare to go there, bringing these subjects we often keep to ourselves into the realm of conversation, into the context of community, where the unbearable might become possible to face with the help of the Spirit and many companions. You're listening to the Multiply podcast. I'm Carson Sampson of Mennonite Brethren Church of Manitoba.
And I'm Carla Brown of the MB Herald. The Government of Canada has turned some of our questions about suffering and death from theory into reality by amending the criminal code to allow practitioners to provide medical assistance causing death without facing criminal charges. Today's guests will help us to think, as Christians, about death and suffering in the context of old age, cognitive disability, and mental health. Wanda Derksen has served as chaplain at Donwood Manor for 10 years. This is a Winnipeg seniors housing facility with levels of care from independent living to 24-hour nursing service. Supported by 8 local MB churches, Donwood's mission is to care for seniors with dignity, respect, and Christian values, and to uphold personal dignity through compassionate service and Christian love. Wanda is a member of Jubilee Mennonite Church in North Kildonan, and she has lately shared sermons in several local churches. Wanda, thank you for coming to share your experience with us.
Thank you.
We also have Paul Doerksen with us. Paul's journey has taken him from youth pastor to Bible teacher at MBCI to professor at Canadian Mennonite University, where he currently teaches theology and Anabaptist studies. Along the way, he completed Master of Theological Studies at Conrad Grebel University College and a Doctor of Philosophy in Western Religious Thought at McMaster University. He's also served several terms on the National Mennonite Brethren Board of Faith and Life. Paul is also on the board of L'Arche Winnipeg, an organization that creates homes with people who have an intellectual disability. Wanda, welcome here. Thank you for taking time out of your day to speak with us. Can you give us a bit of a background on what you do as a chaplain?
As in Donwood Manor, I offer compassionate spiritual care to all the residents living in Donwood Manor. And this involves one-on-one visits, providing support to family, offering spiritual care through being present with residents in the last days and moments of their lives. So I'm involved in providing initial spiritual care assessments on each resident as they move into Donwood. And in this assessment, we look at spiritual needs. Spiritual needs maybe include meaning and purpose in life, a need to be loved and to love, and the need for hope. And also we look at how this resident may experience God and what is his or her religious beliefs. And there is a strong religious component to my position. As a Mennonite Brethren affiliated personal care home, we provide religious Sunday morning services, weekly Bible studies, and on-unit weekly chapel services. And many of our residents are religious and appreciate someone sharing their faith with them, which includes offering a prayer, reading the Bible, or some other inspirational story. So we have a pretty strong, close to 50% Christian community, well, about 95% Christian community in Donwood Manor.
Sounds like a huge task. Are you part of a larger team that's servicing?
I share spiritual care with all the staff and volunteers in Donwood.
The church services on Sunday morning, do you preside over those, or is that...
I coordinate the church services with the Mennonite Brethren churches and a couple of Mennonite churches.
So that's one area where you see a lot of volunteers coming through.
Yes, we do.
So we talked about the MAID legislation earlier, the medical assistance in dying. As a chaplain, how has that affected your work?
My work has not changed since that has come into being. We have not had anyone yet to ask to be referred to the MAID team. When and if that were to happen, the response from the staff in Donwood would remain compassionate and non-judgmental. Yeah.
Some faith-based organizations have, like St. Boniface Hospital, have taken a position that they will not have that happening in their facilities. Has Donwood taken a stand or a position on this, or they will simply deal with it when it comes?
Donwood has a policy that is in response to requests for medical assistance in dying. And our position is to exercise the facility's institutional right to conscientious objection and to be an abstaining facility. So that means that the administering and prescribing of a substance to a person at their request that causes death will not be allowed in Donwood Manor on the property. Should a resident express a wish for MAID, Donwood Manor physicians and staff shall respond in a holistic manner to understand the request and engage in the interprofessional team and a person-centered response. So, express requests for MAID shall be respectfully acknowledged without judgment, coercion, and retaliation of any kind. So as you can tell, I'm kind of reading from our policy, what our policy is. Just to be clear, any request for MAID will be passed on by the healthcare providers in our facility to our DOC, our Director of Care, or our CEO, who will then contact the Executive Director of the WRHA Long-Term Care Program to follow up with the resident to directly discuss MAID. So that's, and we, Donwood shall allow the MAID team to complete their assessment process at Donwood. However, for the administering of MAID, we require that our resident be transferred out for that.
At the beginning of your response there, I heard you say a person-centered response, and that strikes me as something that would fall under your purview as chaplain. Can you speak a little bit more about how you would define what is a person-centered response?
Well, it's a part of what I do is we offer compassionate care, and we care for not just the physical needs but the emotional, mental, and spiritual needs of each of our residents. And it's interesting because we have residents, there's people throughout community that from time to time they just feel like they want to die. And as a chaplain, I hear that, and other staff members hear that. And so when we hear someone wishing to die, it alerts us and alerts me to that there's a need that's not being met. There's some suffering that is happening and we are not meeting a need. So then we explore what that need might be. For example, is the person lonely? Is there a loss of, a sense of identity? There's so much that has been lost. And how much physical pain is a resident under? My first thought is that there's pain that needs to be managed that isn't being managed appropriately. So we assess, and a part of my job is compassionate presence with people and with the residents, and that might include being with people when they feel like dying, or they have, they're at that place in their emotion and mental thinking, and to be with them, to offer whatever spiritual care that I can provide.
In the face of this of pain and the fear of loss, can you speak a little bit about the role of palliative care? Does it, as a chaplain, what would be your role in something like that? Is that part of what Donwood offers to its residents?
Yeah, very much. Palliative care is a big part of what we offer, and we offer an end-of-life protocol where pain is managed as a part of palliative care. It's like, often I can't speak on the healthcare side so much, but my limited understanding is the regular meds that keep you going are kind of taken away, and the medication that gives you comfort is provided, like pain management, and of course spiritual care is a part of that, and sitting with someone and listening to a life story, exploring what what this means, as life gets closer to the end, and being supportive for the family. We offer a No One Dies Alone program, which I coordinate, where volunteers come in and will sit with residents who do not have anyone to sit with them.
And these volunteers wouldn't necessarily have a relationship with the person beforehand, or?
Not necessarily, but they've been trained. And our staff are I shouldn't say more than just, but they are more than just focused on the physical, but on the emotional, spiritual, mental needs of our residents. It's a very loving, wonderful place.
Thank you, Wanda. We can really hear your passion for the residents and your concern to minister to people's spiritual needs. In the discussions about MAID and end of life, we hear concepts like quality of life and dignity. As people of faith, I wonder if we need to challenge the societal narratives on what these ideas mean and shift to kingdom lenses. So, Paul, we turn to you as a theologian. How would you advise Christians to think about where human dignity comes from? As Anabaptists, do we have a different definition of what makes us human?
I think we might. I want to just back up and start by applauding the way you formulated the question. This notion that maybe one of the things that Christians ought to be doing is paying very careful attention to the way the discussion is going on, the categories that are being employed to have the discussion and to shape legislation and practice and so on. And might it be the case, I think Christians should ask, that we need to employ other kinds of categories through which we can do our conceptual and theological and pragmatic work. And so for Christians to ask what's Christian about that, I think is an extremely important step in whatever topic that we're talking about. So if we're talking about medical assistance in dying, and I looked over the WRHA eligibility criteria for medical assistance in dying and just took a quick look at it, and you don't have to be much of a close reader to see that a lot of the language has to do with making decisions and having a voluntary request, informed consent, and being aware of options. And so one of the fundamental categories, I take it, in being eligible to ask for medical assistance in dying is freedom of choice. And so as a Christian, what I want to ask is unfettered freedom of choice a Christian value? Is that something that we embrace? Is that something that we express without thinking about it? And I don't know that would that would qualify as a fundamental Christian value by which we want to think about these matters. And so maybe we want to think about other kinds of things in addition to our understanding of freedom. Another part of the conversation, of course, is rights. And as you've already pointed out, the notion of dignity, and we often hear of the term the sacredness of life. We also hear terms such as quality of life. And as a Christian, I think you're absolutely right. I want to ask about all of those things, first of all, whether or not those are Christian kinds of things to embrace. And secondly, is the shape of those things different if you are a Christian? And so, to pick just one of them, the notion of dignity, I don't quite know what to say about that. I mean, what's dignified about dying? One of my favorite songwriters, singers these days, is Jason Isbell. And one of the lines in one of his recent albums is, he says in the song, he realizes that no one dies with dignity. It's a song about a cancer patient, and I think Isbell is right about that. So maybe dignity can't do the work for Christians that sometimes it's asked to do. So how else might we think about these matters if we're trying to think as people who have our lives and our thoughts and our practices shaped by the gospel? Well, I wonder if thinking about life as a gift from God, it's not going to make these discussions and decisions any easier, but I think it might make it different. What about what do we mean by sacredness of life? Even the MB Confession of Faith uses that kind of language, and I've always been a bit uncomfortable with it because I think it can be misused. Because it's not only human life that's sacred, right? We Christians believe that all of life is sacred in one sense, but that doesn't mean, what doesn't imply is that we hang on to life, human life, as an end in itself, because that's not a Christian view of life or of death, right? And so, and then there's the notion of rights. I think it's very easy to use almost as a default position this notion that what's most important is that a person has the right to make an unfettered choice. So now you've got two categories going, rights and freedom, that are very, very compelling. I find them personally compelling, right? I mean, I sympathize very, very strongly with people who want medical assistance in dying, but that's not my Christian character. That's just because I'm a chicken, right? I don't want to suffer any more than anybody else does. But I do think that making that move to thinking theologically, I don't mean in esoteric terms. I mean in very pragmatic terms, like you introduced this. Is should we think in these terms or these terms? To try and introduce Christian categories into how we work at this, I think is just extremely important. I mean, if I can just give you a very personal example, our beloved mom just died in October, and she was very badly demented near the end, and had in 2004 had her first stroke, which introduced a long period of what we it's easy to describe it as declension, just a steady decline. Along the way, I read, and a couple of my brothers read a book called Dementia by John Swinton. It's really interesting. It affected me very much because instead of first thinking of dementia as a cluster of symptoms or as a neurophysiological disease and so on, and then bringing some theological observations to bear on the way the discussion was already framed, what Swinton does is flips that around. And he begins the book by doing some very, very fine theological work, specifically on theological anthropology. What does it mean to be a human? What is a Christian view of what it means to be a human? So if we think of humans, for example, only as the capacity, some kind of a capacity, let's say intellectual or relational or whatever else, then as soon as a person doesn't have that capacity, like my mom, near the end of her life did not have relational nor intellectual capacity. And if that's how I would have thought of her, if that's what made her a human, then of course she's been diminished as a human. And so what Swinton does is work at those kinds of things and say, there's something else. So life is a gift. It's God's attention to us, and it is us, as he puts it, very, very memorably, is that we live in the memory of God. And so we are fully human, no matter what level of capacity we might have or not have. Whether he's right or not, what he's done is, then what he does is once he's done his theological heavy lifting, then he brings, and he has a medical background as well, Swinton does, then he brings scientific medical information, but now he's thinking about that stuff within the framework of his theological work that he's done. Again, nothing's less complex, but the discussion is different, right? What you're trying to understand is, what does it mean for someone to be human if you believe that life is a gift? Is that and if it's true that I can be fully human even though I can't put two thoughts together and can't relate to anybody because I'm fully demented, this surely changes things. What it does, for example, is it introduces one of the important things it introduces, seems to me, is that Christians have to embrace dependence. Right? It's very difficult to do, right? But that would be one of the things that become important. And it might be the case that at some point in our lives, the moral responsibility, the Christian moral responsibility we have, is to become fully dependent on somebody else. Right? Because after all, care for the dying or the demented or those with intellectual disabilities isn't just a one-way street. And this is one of the things that my work at L'Arche has taught me so much, is that Jean Vanier and everybody who's followed him, one of the things that I've tried to learn there is the possibility of mutual transformation. We often think of care as somebody who has the capacity delivering something to somebody who is weak, and there is that, right? My mom wasn't able to reciprocate much at the end of her life, right? But it's the case that the person who, let's say, delivers the care, Vanier is just insistent on this, has to be open to the possibility of transformation that comes from the gifts that are given to you by the person who we understand as weak. So in L'Arche, that has to do with people with intellectual disabilities. What sorts of mutual transformation can go on in the kind of a community where I don't just see myself as somebody delivering something, but I come there as somebody who is fully open to what I need to be taught by the people with whom I live in community. And of course, Henry Nouwen's writings are just absolutely wonderful on providing sort of a display of how this dynamic works.
Yeah. Wanda, go ahead.
Yeah, I very much appreciate your comment about life being a gift from God, because that's how, as Christians, or my faith, that's my understanding, and is our understanding in Donwood, is that our lives are a gift, and regardless, so I appreciate that, and that we don't own our life, but it is God's life that we are gifted with for a time. And also your the way you've put out your talk about dementia, and in Donwood, and I hear this time and time again, and I experience it every day, that I get so much more than I give. And I hear that from the volunteers as well. There is this, it's relationship, it's connection. It's so much more than just providing care to someone. It's a mutuality, which I think is from God too.
And what about suffering? What does the Bible teach us about it? Does Jesus as our model challenge us to a different perspective on suffering?
I can respond to that a bit. Life for each of us involves times that are just plain hard and hard work. And the older one gets, it seems the more is taken away. As one's independence and health diminish, I believe there is more room for that which is of spirit. There comes a point when a person no longer needs to be successful or have a position of affluence or have wealth. And this is the blessing of old age. As the material part of us gets smaller, there becomes more room for that which is spiritual, that which is love. There's more room for love. There's more room for acceptance. There's more. Richard Rohr alludes to this in his book Falling Upward, that and I see it, that we in our early years, we we're very focused on self and getting ahead and all the material that comes along with that. But as we age, we have less of a need to be successful, to be somebody in this world. And then there's more room for more God, more goodness. And I think that connects with the blessing of being more dependent on others, or more accepting of that.
Is this an inevitable path, or does this require grace from us? Does this require, as Paul talked about, the willingness to be dependent on others and to receive from others?
I think people are given an invitation for grace, are given an invitation. I don't know if I can be more clear than that.
I was going to say we have a choice to respond then, but now I'm going back to assuming that choice is the greatest good for us.
Yeah.
Paul, can you speak a little bit to this question of suffering?
Yeah, it's unclear to me. I have to confess that Jesus' suffering is a model for us. It seems to me that there are all kinds of suffering, and not all of them, and not all the kinds of suffering are of the sort that Jesus endured. And so there's different kinds of reasons, and very often suffering that comes from illness is very hard to think of it as purposeful. And I want to resist as strongly as possible an equation between suffering and lessons from God that is as though there's a direct causal connection between bad things that happen to me and something that God's trying to teach me. I think we're in pretty sketchy ground if we try to make those kinds of equations. But having said that, neither do we want to sort of be nihilistic and think that suffering is completely meaningless. And so, as a Christian, one wants to think that perhaps there might be something that could happen as a result of finding oneself suffering. So if it's suffering that's brought about specifically because of the expression of your faith, that's one kind of suffering, but it's suffering that comes about that we often associate with the things that lead toward death. I think the community is absolutely important. There's all kinds of spiritual practices. I'm trying to work during my sabbatical on a book about moral patience, and trying to understand. One of the things I want to understand is the importance of the practice of patience in a situation that is beyond your control. That is, you didn't bring it on yourself because of the expression of your faith or whatever, but you still want to act like a Christian within a Christian community, given the situation that you find yourself in. And I think there, Christ's endurance and so on can act as a model. And so suffering, well, and death as well, it seems to me, are Christians are inherently ambivalent about both of those things, right? Mennonites have a long tradition of embracing certain kinds of suffering just a bit too enthusiastically. It seems to me there's a certain pathology that some of our poets and novelists have identified in our obsession with certain stories of the Martyr's Mirror, for example, certain ways of construing that open the way for us understanding needless or violent or sort of taking violence and saying that, well, I'm just following Christ's example because after all he was stoic in his suffering, right? So I think that we have to be extremely careful about how we understand these things. But having said all of those things, suffering and death is something that we often confront, often beyond our control, and yet there are possibilities within it, both for the individual believer and also for the community in terms of endurance, perseverance, response, learning, learning how to be dependent, learning how to care, which is why I find it absolutely wonderful that at Donwood Manor you have somebody that's called the director of care. I think that's I don't know if someone chose it randomly, but it seems to me to be a very important category. It's not the director of cure, right? That would be a very different sort of a position, wouldn't it? Right? It's not, interestingly, not the director of compassion. It's a director of care. That seems to me to be a Christian position, right? Because there's a lot of other kinds of things that can be conjured up under some of those other categories. So suffering, is suffering meaningless? I don't think so. But it's not something that we pursue, right? But there are Christian ways of responding, it seems to me.
I'm wondering if fear is, as I'm listening to you, Paul, talk about, as Christians, we're ambivalent about some of these concepts, and I wonder if fear maybe creates a bit of the dividing line between whether we run away from these concepts or whether we're able to hold them with that ambivalence of sort of the good and the bad. Is the fear of loss, pain, suffering, lack of meaning, is that something that as Christians we are able to relinquish to God, and that gives us the strength to hold these things loosely?
That's a great question.
Yeah.
I do think that fear is central here. I don't quite know what to make of it. I think that if I can speak far too generally and broadly, that if I can make an observation about medicine more generally, and so with my apologies and disclaimers for being too general, so it seems to me that medicine and technology in combination often are now able to take such heroic measures for the purpose of trying to stave off death virtually at all costs. So there's, on the one hand, there's that dynamic within medicine, right? So we have a fear of not being able to fix things that we see, because after all, we are so smart, we've developed so much that we should be able to fix virtually anything, right? So there's a fear of not being able to cure something, and then, but once it becomes clear that we're unable to be successful at curing somebody, we then ironically turn to now offering technology to assist in dying, right? So those two things, which are, I guess you can put them together, but they seem to me to be a bit of odds, and I think that both of those are in some way based on fear. Right? There's a fear of a loss of control, that we aren't in control as much as we think we ought to be, and then there's the fear of death, which is completely understandable, it seems to me, and there's the fear of suffering in between, not being able to make that transition. And then we've already talked about this too, but there's a fear of being dependent. Right? People saying, I'm going to go and get medical assistance in dying because I see that the disease that I've been diagnosed with is going to leave me a drooling kind of a vegetable, to which one might respond, well, there are a lot of people who find themselves in that situation for years. People who need help of a kind that can be seen one way as undignified, or it can be seen as a dependent person receiving help from a caring person the caring person in the process of being involved in that relationship also changing as the dependent person interacts and so on. So I think fear is in the middle of all that, and I mean, I'm not sure what else to say about that. I remember, I'm sorry to bring up all my family death stories here, but in 2013, my brother just older than me died after being a quadriplegic since he was 21, and then very sadly being in the hospital for 3 years. It was a terrible situation, most of all for him, let me just be clear. I remember a doctor saying that, if he was on a respirator, and there's always talk about at what point should we shut these things down, right? And so we're asking all kinds of questions. And I remember him saying, well, we can give him whatever kind of medicine he needs to help him settle down, but there's no medicine for fear. And that sort of haunts me, and I wouldn't know what else to say about that, except one of the things we have to acknowledge is that that's a fear, and I can't help but think of the gospel that teaches us that perfect love casts out fear.
Yeah.
But I wouldn't trot that out as a cliche. Right? The reality of fear and the reality of God's love are very strong. And I don't have the skill or the capacity to be able to say just how one casts out the other.
I think that's where spiritual care comes in, and that's where God comes in.
Oh, fair enough.
And that's where our compassion and love and grace comes in to be that presence of love. And I see it as casting out the fear. My father passed away in March, and at the age of 90 on his birthday, and I had the opportunity to be with him the week before he passed, and in Ohio. And I am so grateful that I had that week. Mm-hmm. And he was agitated and fearful and not knowing, and yet he was able to embrace our love and the family's love for him, and the compassion that came to him through healthcare people in our midst, and he had a good death. Mm-hmm. It was a good death, and we had an opportunity to love him to the fullest as he was coming to the end. And that's the other concern I have about assisted dying, is taking that opportunity away from families and from people to experience a good death.
And the mutual transformation in
that
the caregiver and the care recipient.
Mm-hmm.
Well, thank you, Wanda and Paul, for sharing so thoughtfully and so vulnerably. In the July-August issue of the MB Herald, author Sharon Simpson laid down a challenge. She said, I invite you to consider how your church, your time, your ministry, your heart, and your resources can contribute to the unique and vital ministry of end-of-life care. So Paul and Wanda, in closing, do you have any advice or invitation to our listeners, pastors and church members, how they could take action to contribute to this unique and vital ministry of end-of-life care?
I sure do. Well, our Mennonite Brethren churches in Winnipeg are an amazing example of a community of faith who walk with their loved ones at the end of their lives. And we encourage the deacons of all church faiths to come and visit the members of their churches in Donwood Manor. We have a very loving community of auxiliary women, and that are part of the No One Dies Alone program, those wonderful souls and volunteers. But the churches, the deacons, the pastors, to come and visit is so important. So my advice is to come to Donwood Manor, volunteer, and visit your elderly church members. And that's it.
Wanda.
That's great advice. I was going to say, too, that I think that the church is absolutely central here to whatever sort of advice I'd want to give. It's tempting to pour our energy into trying to resist or become activist about legislation, as though if we're going to do something about this, we have to do it at the level of electoral politics. Whereas, the church's involvement with actual people who are in the midst of living and dying, it seems to me to be the thing to do as the church, and also the way to be to have an impact on societal practices in this area. Go to Donwood Manor, Bethesda, where my mom was, all these sorts of places, and pastors. I have no idea what it takes to be a pastor these days. It's very complicated work, I'm sure, but I would say doing the sort of behind the scenes work of showing up at people's bedsides. I don't know how much pastors do that these days, but if they don't, I would suggest that practice ought to be rehabilitated. And if they do, keep doing it. I still remember when I was in grade 6 in the hospital, Pastor Peters, a lay minister, came to visit me and threw me a quarter. I mean, that's a long time ago, and that was obviously a very memorable moment. So the church needs to take its role as the community of faith in issues of death and dying absolutely seriously, it seems to me.
Well, thank you, Paul and Wanda, for your challenge to us and for your wisdom that you've shared.
In part 2 of our focus on medical assistance in dying, we will be speaking with Evelyn Laboon. Evelyn is not only a registered nurse, but a doctor of nursing science with a long career in teaching. Evelyn also serves on the board of Eden Healthcare Services, an organization rooted in Anabaptist Mennonite values that provides a range of services to empower persons with mental health needs. We want to hear from you. Do you have a comment to share? Our show notes include links to the July-August issue of the Herald, and also the articles pertaining to dying and aging. Please leave a comment online or email us at mbherald@mbchurches.ca. The Multiply podcast is brought to you by Mennonite Brethren Church of Manitoba, the MB Herald, and MB Mission. Our theme music is provided by Bread We Break. The song is called Come Morning, and it's off their EP of the same name. It's available on iTunes. You can subscribe to the podcast at Apple Podcasts, SoundCloud. You'll also see us on YouTube. Thanks for listening.
But you fill my ears with melodies as the sun breaks the night. The sun breaks the night. You fill my eyes with wonder and awe, enraptured by your love.